Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone to this panel about science and its portrayal in film and fiction and nonfiction film. And I'd like to welcome everyone who is viewing this panel after we recorded it. And today we are joined by some fabulous filmmakers, scientists, and thinkers to talk about this topic. So I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves one by one. You can go ahead and start, Aleem.
Hi, I'm Aleem Hossain. I am a fiction filmmaker. I'm a writer-director. I most recently wrote and directed the feature film After We Leave, which is a sort of near-future sci-fi drama that got out theatrically just before the pandemic hit, thankfully in a brief release, and then is now on Amazon Prime. And I'm also the professor of digital storytelling at Occidental College, where I teach sort of filmmaking and writing and a little bit of new media, and thinking a lot about just issues of representation and who gets to be part of those fields.
Okay, Wade, can you add?
Yeah, great to be here. I'm Wade Roush, and I'm an independent science and technology journalist and audio maker. I have a podcast called Soonish, which is all about the future and how we shape the future and how the future shapes us, how technology shapes the future and how we shape technology. And on the sci-fi side, I edited a anthology of hard science fiction for MIT Press back in 2018. It was called 12 Tomorrows. And so that was a great project to be involved in. And I got to know a whole bunch of cutting edge, active, short science fiction story writers. So that was a great experience.
Thank you. Thomas, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Tom Levenson. I've had a number of lives. Currently, I'm a professor of science writing at MIT, and most of my productive work right now is writing books about the history of science and its culture and the ways it all happens to us and how it implicates our present. But I also have a fairly long history as a documentary filmmaker about science and engineering, with a lot of stuff on places like Nova back in the day.
Thank you. Alexis?
Yeah, hi, I'm Alexis Gambis. I'm a biologist and a filmmaker. I also teach at NYU, both in the biology department as well as in the film department. I actually just had a film that was selected 3 hours ago at Sundance. So in the next category, it's my second feature, which is about a Mexican scientist who basically connects to his homeland through the monarch butterflies. I'm also very interested in representations of scientists and science in film, and I run a film festival in New York called Imagine Science, which is all about broadening the definition of what a science film is. We show fiction, documentary, animation, and I also started a platform called Labocine, which is also about bridging form in science communication. So,
All right. And last but not least, Taryn, could you please introduce yourself?
Congratulations, Lexi. That's so exciting.
a lot of messages. So
I wasn't able to move or speak within hours of hearing of my last film festival acceptance letter, so kudos to you. My name is Taryn Southern. I'm an artist, storyteller, and filmmaker. I primarily work with emerging technology companies to help them tell better stories through digital campaigns, experiments, films, pretty much anything that I believe could, create a headline-worthy sort of tech and science optimistic story. I also co-directed and produced a documentary called I Am Human, which follows 3 people with implantable brain interfaces, which premiered at Tribeca last year.
We'll start it off with kind of a simple question. So kind of one best and worst example of science in film. So things that, knowing a little bit about scientists, even if you're not a scientist, like just watching it and you're like, what the hell are they saying? or films that are like, wow, that actually is a good interpretation of the real thing. So who wants to start?
I guess I can start. I think one big mishap sometimes in science films is I think that a lot of it has to do with this idea that when you fictionalize science, you there's a misconception that you have to necessarily bend the science, but there's a lot of scientific research that is being done today that kind of lends itself really well to fictional filmmaking, and you can kind of play around with that interface between science fiction but also magical realism, and I feel like sometimes there's this tendency that we need to kind of push the science into dystopian ways in order to communicate it into film or sensationalize it. But I think there's a lot of material out there that lends itself really well to fiction films. And I think what Aleem was saying, I think representation is a big issue. Just better representation. In my case, I had a Latino scientist who was my main lead in my last film called Son of Monarchs, and I think there just needs to be more, more representation in the roles of scientists, and connecting the science also to personal lives and to personal drama and these types of things. So it's always hard to define what a good science film is versus a bad one, but I think those are the kind of guiding rules that I go by when I think about science film.
I have a couple of examples. One is the movie IQ. Did you all see that? It's an oldie one. It's a marvelous sort of spoof fiction film with Walter Matthau playing Albert Einstein at Princeton and Meg Ryan playing his niece. And the science in that film isn't supposed to be serious, right? They have, they make fun of behavioral psychology, they make fun of physics and do all that sort of stuff. But there's a moment that always just, both as a filmmaker and as a science communicator, just makes me, angry every time I see it. And it's when Meg Ryan is working out the implications of something that her uncle and the love interest in the film have figured out. And she goes through this whole speech that's full of just technical science stuff. It's just language, right? And at one point she says, and because atoms are so much bigger than protons, blah, 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 blah. And that's just a completely, the whole speech is just supposed to be, smart stuff, right? And that's just it's a minor error. I mean, who cares? But it's this just completely gratuitous mistake. Didn't need to happen. Could have been solved with, they were filming at Princeton with, sort of Nobel laureates on top of Nobel laureates in the building they were working in, and they couldn't get that one right. And that, it's that kind of unnecessary sloppiness. One quick read and it's right, and then you're done. And that's one example. Another example comes from documentary. I remember years ago, there was a very high budget, high profile series about astronomy. And it was supposed to show the sort of the marvelous, extent to which clever people were now using extraordinary machines to see further and see deeper by seeing further. It's great, and perfectly. I mean, I've made movies like that, and it's a perfectly respectable, take and all that. But they had this one scene where they've got one astronomer who's a divorced father, and they show him making breakfast for his kid. It's almost like that scene in Tootsie where the first time that Dustin Hoffman tries to make pancakes, and then the last time he makes pancakes, like that. And it was this sort of, oh look, I'm a regular person too. And it's fine. But that wasn't what the film was about. It was like this, it just sort of took you completely out of this sort of need to say, okay, scientists are not, monsters or super geniuses or whatever it is they may be. So we're going to show you making pancakes. And you're showing oh, you're a divorced father, you can figure this out. Or you have, you put on your trousers one leg at a time in the morning. And again, it's like, same rule applies for science films as does for any other films. If you're putting in a shot, if you're putting in a line of dialogue, it has to mean something in terms of the film. It shouldn't just check a box. And that was, it just sort of threw me out of that particular movie. And I never really bought into the series after that, which is not what you want.
That's a fair point.
I read this quote the other day. James Gray, the director of Ad Astra, he took quite a few hits on that film for scientific accuracy. And he raised this point that I thought was actually a really good one, which is I feel like sometimes the attacks on films for having bad science are a little bit like misplaced or besides the point in some ways. Like he was sort of making this point that like, look, nobody looks at the Icarus myth and is like, whoa, 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 wax, wings, sun, like that wouldn't work. Scientifically, the physics of those wings, Icarus couldn't have flown that way. Like it's besides the point, right? Like, and I do think that like sometimes we're not seeing the forest for the trees. And so like when I was trying to think about like what are the films that I really like I really like the depiction of, it's a little bit adjacent to science, it's more linguistics, but the depiction of like a method and a desire to have sequential inquiry that's presented in Arrival when she's just trying to unpack the language. To me, I think there are probably a bunch of scientific errors in there we could even highlight. Maybe even linguists would hate some of the exact details. But in terms of like depicting that like there can be like a method and you pursue a method for a reason and it's trial and error and it's experimentation. I like seeing stuff like that. Like I actually feel like a lot of times I'm less bothered, although I agree with you, Tom. It's like, Tom, sometimes like there's such a tiny change they could have made to get it right. Why not get it right, guys? Come on. But sometimes I feel like, you know, there's these tropes of like, you know, all scientists are like crazy visionaries who believe like the ends justify the means and I'm gonna, you know, throw out morals to get that, or like those experiments are always going out of control, right? In science fiction, they're always getting away from us, and even when we have like more grounded films where they glorify like, oh, here's this singular, unique breakthrough by this individual. I think what I really like when I see it is this idea of like, hey, guess what? Science is oftentimes a collaborative, incremental process. You know, science embraces being wrong, right? You know, like, oh, look, like, you know, sometimes science, the goal is not to change the world, but it's like to like get this one little thing, understand it a little better. And I feel like that's pretty rarely done, especially in fiction films. And then what's funny is I think they miss highlighting the things that actually are troublesome with science. Like there's very few films that are about the blind spot both within practitioners of science and with research subjects when it comes to women and people of color, right? Like, so it's almost like they miss the things you could criticize about science and then overplay all of these things that aren't really negatives about science. Like there are very few crazy guys throwing morals out the window and creating an experiment that goes out of control would destroy the world. I don't think that's happened yet, you know, like, so I do feel like that it's interesting to sort of feel like there are things to critique in science and probably even to play up, but I almost feel like that it's like really out of whack in that way.
Aleem, I'd say I take your view for the most part. There are lots of areas to critique in these spaces, but for me, just taking the 10,000 foot view and saying, well, what's been the impact of this film in terms of broader public education of these scientific ideals or values or education. So I was reminded actually of a film that came back into the public zeitgeist this year, Contagion, even though it was made a while back. You know, while I'm sure that there are a number of scientific inaccuracies, it was one of the first films to, I think, really profoundly explain to the public the potential for problems around infectious diseases. And not only that, but it also happened to predict with relatively scary accuracy a number of the elements that have led to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there were a lot of people that have brought that film back into the public sphere and started talking about it and kind of picking it apart and saying, well, what's accurate and what's inaccurate here? But ultimately, there was a whole group of filmmakers who felt like, well, we tried to do our best to warn the public that this could happen. And I do think that they did a stellar job at that.
For me, I think my favorite films are the ones where they're very clear about the bar they're setting, and then they live up to it in terms of the accuracy. And Contagion was definitely one of those kinds of films. In the space genre, yeah, I had all the same problems with Ad Astra, but a film that got it right was Gravity, right? And I reserve special scorn for films that set a high bar and then fail to live up to it. And so like a very recent mainstream kind of blockbuster example, you're gonna laugh at me for this one, but Avengers Endgame, right? I mean, I'm allergic to time travel in the first place, but they went to all this trouble to explain how time travel should work. And they even used a counterexample from Back to the Future, right? About how Marty McFly didn't do it right. And then they go and break their own rules at the end of the movie, right? So that for me was like, ugh. The movies I do like about science are the ones where they set the bar or they want to tell a true story about how science actually works, and then they follow through on that. So, my favorite science movie ever is Contact, based on the Carl Sagan novel, directed by Robert Zemeckis, 1997, because it's as accurate as it can be about something that hasn't happened yet, which is contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. And it's as much about the character of Ellie Arroway, the astronomer, as it is about the events going on around her. And it puts her in this super interesting situation where she has to explore what's the difference between science and faith, right? So it's a fantastic film because it's trying to tell you something about what it means to be human and what it means to be a scientist. And it does really well at both.
I think you're right though, Wade, like this idea that like, what's the contract with the audience? Like, I do think there are certain films, and sometimes not even just in the film, it's like the way the filmmaker or the studio behind it is representing it in a larger like public relations sphere. You're right, like who are like, they're almost like they're staking their claim on it's so authentic, it's so accurate. And in that case, I do feel like we are allowed to judge differently. You know what I mean? Like if you're gonna sort of say to us that one of your merits is your accuracy, well then I think you have put a target on yourself, and you better be able to own that. And I do think that like there are probably the flip side examples of like where it's just not meant to be real. And I think probably the most dangerous terrain is the middle, right? It's like where it's unclear what's being asserted as factual or just fun storytelling. And I do think that there's probably something to critique there, which is like, we do need to make sure, I do think there is, I always get hesitant when we talk about the responsibility of filmmakers, but I do think there's some responsibility in the idea of, are people interpreting what I'm putting into the world as being factual? And if I do think that they are reasonably interpreting it as being factual, I think you have to think about how factual it is,
I think just to add to this discussion about accuracy, I feel like accuracy is something that has been in the discussion about science film recently. I mean, I feel that early films, if we look at films from the French New Wave, like Alphaville or like My American Uncle, and these films, there was a sense, I feel like the more you emphasize this idea of accuracy, the more you can kind of slip and back to this idea of the bar. And I think that ultimately it's about the characters, right? So if the characters are flawed or fragile, or even if they say, extravagant ideas in science, I think that's, that lives up to what the characters are for. And I will point something else about I wanted to point something about scientific jargon. I feel like scientific jargon can be really interesting as just music. Just hearing people speaking, not necessarily focusing on breakthrough, but just hearing scientists speak to each other and just listening to it, and even just focusing on the mannerisms or the way they interact. And I think sometimes, at least when I think about science films, I like not having to dumb down the science, just watching scientists speak in the way they would usually speak. So.
Yeah, that leads into my next question of ways in which, so everyone here has done some sort of science story, whether it be fiction or nonfiction. And I want to discuss like ways in which you guys kind of tackled, because science can be very complex. You have multiple factors going in. How do you tell a story out of that? How do you put it into a fiction story? How do you like not dumb it down, but simplify it to the way that a layman can understand it? So Wade, do you want to start with that?
Okay. Well, I guess that is what I try to do in almost every piece I create, whether it's audio or journalism. I've edited science fiction and I've read a ton of science fiction, but I've never tried my hand at science fiction, so I can't speak to that. I have an aspiration to try that someday and see how bad I am at it. But I guess the trick to making something accessible is to make your grandmother listen to it and tell you whether it was accessible. Or try to have a model of a non-expert in your head while you're writing. And that's my trick. And sometimes I actually do ask friends to read over drafts and tell me what I'm missing. Because at this point, I've been, especially if I'm months into a project, I don't have any objectivity about it. I've lost my ability to filter whether something sounds normal street language or whether it's jargony in some way. So there's no other way than to get an outside reader. That's my best piece of advice.
Aleem, so you with your film After We Leave, how did you kind of add the science aspect of?
It's interesting. I think my film actually is a sort of result of like I did think about this question, and I have this notebook where I have my like the ideas I brainstorm for films. I can go back a couple years ago and I can see the 3 ideas I was weighing before I chose to make After We Leave, and one of them was like a hard sci-fi idea, and then 2 of them were one of them was After We Leave were not, and they're sort of more social sort of speculation about the future. I actually, and I'm sure I'll waffle. At the moment, I'm not sure I feel like fiction filmmaking is the best format for hard science fiction. In other words, like I'm actually not sure. I think some of the constraints of fictional storytelling work against like actually imparting hard scientific information in an accurate way.
What are the constraints?
I mean, I think some of the constraints of like what the expectations are of a story in the feature film format in terms of like character arc and story progression. But what I do think is very, very much a part of fiction filmmaking. Actually, Alexis was talking about this as well, probably in his work as well. Is the interplay between like the individual and the act of science, like what it means for someone to be a scientist, and what certain breakthroughs can have on a society or on the world. I think there is something there. It's like my film is about, it posits the ability to have off-planet colonies. I don't get into the tech of that. I kind of decided, like, let's say that exists. And you will not find in my film an explanation. So there's no one who can nitpick, well, I don't know if that, method of terraforming this or that, I don't even get into whether we're terraforming or not. There's a colony out there. We never see it. But I'm exploring what happens to Earth when that exists. And that's a part of fiction filming that I do understand, and I think that is related to this, which is to say, like, all sorts of major technological and scientific advancements create social change and create political change and have an impact. And for me right now, that's what I have felt like I understand how to explore. I don't think it's a definitive statement like on all film, but for me, like that's where I have found it, because I actually feel like I see so many great podcasts and motion graphic informational videos and documentaries that explore really interesting scientific concepts that I'm not sure I know whether fiction is doing better on that one front.
That's a fair point. So, Alexi, I know you've done a bit of both fiction and nonfiction. So, how do you tackle that in both genres?
Yeah, actually, it's a good point, because a lot of my work is combining documentary and fiction. So I like playing around with people not really understanding having a hard time defining the form. I think is a big part of my, I think it's also part of the questioning is not only questioning what's happening in the film, but also questioning the format. Like, am I watching something that is real or not real? Is it documentary? So I integrate scientists in the film. I'm very interested in surrealism, so I shoot a lot through microscopes, like very kind of visceral. I'm also kind of anti VFX. I like it to feel very kind of organic and almost, I don't know if you ever saw that film, the Killing of a Sacred Deer, the Yorgos Lanthimos film, but it starts with like this palpitating heart. Colin Farrell is a heart surgeon, and so I have a lot of shots like that, and I often use the animal because my films are often about animals. I use it as kind of a starting point to develop the story. So I think about whether it was flies for my first film, which was about the birthplace of genetics in the 1920s in New York. It's called The Fly Room. And then and Son of Monarchs is about butterflies. And right now I'm working on one about rats and memory. So I use the animal as kind of like my kind of alter ego, and giving me kind of the direction. And I oftentimes put the POV of the animal into the film. Well, animals observing scientists, and of course making a comment about, animal ethics and animal testing and those things. But I think, integrating scientists into the film, using, as Aleem was saying, using the tools and the mechanics of the lab, and also playing with form, I think is really important, and using the lab as a setting for that. So I think these are all kind of interesting ideas, because ultimately you're making a film where you're having people question things in science, so you may as well do that with the form as well. So
Yeah, exactly. So Taryn, you did a more traditional scientific documentary. How did you tackle kind of having to, because with every documentary, you always get more than you could possibly fit in a film. So how did you tackle narrowing it down and telling that story?
It was really challenging. For one, trying to unpack the field of neuroscience as a non-neuroscientist / non-scientist in general was a really big undertaking, figuring out what information was going to be critical for the story, what stories we actually wanted to tell. We followed 6 patients, but we ended up actually only featuring 3 through the film for a number of different reasons. But I was so worried about the scientists that had participated in the film, entrusted myself and my co-director with their life's work. And they showed up to the premiere, and Elena, my co-director, and I were just sitting there bracing for any potential inaccuracies or even just the way that something might be presented or contextualized if it doesn't fit their paradigm, and we were pleasantly surprised that everyone seemed pretty happy with it. But I think it was a big challenge. I mean, for us, we actually kept a notebook of all from the very, very beginning of our interviews with scientists and institutions, all the scientific jargon that we were coming across, because as neuroscientists, we knew that by the end of the film, we would be very familiar with all this terminology, and that would not be helpful for a broader audience. So we wanted to make sure that we kept a running log of every sort of question or, thing that we didn't quite understand as we went along, so that when we actually finished the film, we're like, does this make sense to the average person who has 0 experience in science?
And Taryn, did you do any audience testing on that topic? Did you show the film specifically just to figure out, do you guys even get what's did you do any of that?
We had a couple rough cuts. I mean, the problem with the rough cuts is they didn't really make sense because we were still mapping out the character storylines. But in terms of the science, it was actually very helpful to do a couple of Google Drive link send outs to people where then they could type in a thing. We also learned what information was irrelevant to the audience. There was a lot of science information that I felt like the neuroscientists that we were dealing with, they felt was the most critical piece of information, or they felt was the most exciting piece. And so, in wanting to honor their work, where we're trying to stuff it in there. And it was the audience in those tests, as you pointed out, that were so why do we need to know this information? Who cares? Is it necessary? And so we were able to cut back actually quite a lot of, and that was the most interesting thing that I figured out, is actually cutting a lot of the science and letting things play out in the action. People walked away with a better understanding of what was going on by seeing it happen than by listening to a scientist explain it.
That was my experience when I actually worked at Nova. I started at Nova in late 1985, early 1986. And I was on staff for 5 or 6 years, and then I kept working with them for quite a while after that. And at the very beginning of my time there, these films were wall-to-wall narration and very dense and very, we are bringing the word of science from the scientist to the audience. And by the end, praise the flying spaghetti monster, it was much, much different. And now I'm going to be teaching my students, an introduction to science documentary starting in February. And every year that I teach that class, one of the most important things that they discover as they make their first documentaries is how much they have to take command of the story. That it's not the scientist's story, it's their story. And they're going to the scientists for certain things that help them tell a story that is what captured them about the first encounter with that work. And it's very, very hard to sort of, particularly if you both feel, in some ways subordinate to the smart person at the other side of the camera. It's very hard sometimes to pull yourself back into your proper perspective, which is, this is my story, I am telling it, I have to figure out what matters in it.
I think that I actually wish more films, both fiction films and nonfiction, were about that process, where I feel like we all are familiar with the idea that years and years of research will end up as like a 1-paragraph Facebook post about what this study supposedly said, right? And we all know the dangers of that, but like, I feel like it would be great to see that both dramatized, but also just explored, like just the challenge and the importance of, here is like some groundbreaking research, but guess what? It's complex and it's nuanced and it's has some unknowns, and if it has a practical application, that application only works if it's communicated at the very least to any sort of stakeholders and maybe even the public at large. And I would love to see something about that process. I think it's just an interesting aspect of science.
Oh, I mean, I agree. I mean, there are lots of films that I want to make but haven't, will never, I need more lives than I am going to be given. But, just that story of extremophiles, these bacteria that live in extreme environments. The first were discovered in a spring, in a hot spring in Yosemite. Not Yosemite. I'm sorry, not Yellowstone, not Yosemite. And it was, purely curiosity that drove it. And year over year over year, that first of all exposed, this whole new domain of life. Not a kingdom, but this whole new sort of environment. It turns out the world is much larger for life than we thought. There's many more places we can go. That's really cool. And the discovery, that's really cool. And at the same time, completely unexpected. There's this whole range of technology that we use now, all the time. Importantly, it bears on how fast we got, a COVID vaccine, all that came out of this, like, a professor and a student, just two guys, playing in hot pools in Yellowstone, which is just great.
But it takes so long for that to unfold. I mean, there are very few areas of science where the time scale and the pace of events is dramatic enough to be adapted into a film or drama without like significant rewriting or significant acceleration of the timeline. And I think that's the terrifying thing. If it's a documentary, you want to be true to the work and the science, and you want to do right by the scientists. But it is your job to make it dramatic and to give it an arc. And so that's the hardest thing in the world.
Well, it's funny because you were talking about Alexis, about the difficulty of making fiction films about science, and I think it's hard to make fiction films in which the science and its development is the primary driver of the narrative. But I think it's actually, first of all, I try and use fiction techniques in all my nonfiction, and secondly, I think I think this was Carl Djerassi, this wonderful chemist, co-inventor of the birth control pill and novelist and gadfly and and patron of the arts, all kinds of wonderful things. But he says he wanted to do science in fiction. He didn't. When he wrote his books, he says these aren't science fiction books. These are lives of scientists doing science. The science, how they do it, and what the pitfalls are very important. But the things the hurdles they overcome or fail to overcome, and the way their difficulties expose their characters, that's what the book was about, not the particular, whether they were studying some piece of biology or whatever. He had different things in different books. And I think that you can do really great communication about science in fiction films as long as your goal isn't to communicate science. Right? You should be science is the engine. You use the science that drives your story, but you don't worry about it if it doesn't. Look.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. So in fiction film, science, like we just kind of discussed how science plays a role in the story, and in the same way as nonfiction content. So what is kind of the role of science in film? What is the duty of accuracy to the audience? Like, how much do you have to show, or how accurate do you have to be in order to tell a story? And what is your duty there, if there is one, to relating this accurate science?
I'm going to jump in ahead of the two actual fiction filmmakers and say the duty is to the story and through the story to the audience, and not to the science.
Yeah, and I think another big trap is that the filmmaker is always considered to be this, like authoritarian figure. It's the filmmaker that has to be the one, the guardian of the accuracy. But if you can somehow displace that responsibility to the actors or to the scientists that are going to be in the film, they all have their own agenda of what they want to portray and how they want to portray it. I find it really interesting, just to the point that was discussed before, is to tell a scientist to act in a fiction film and use those words and see how they maneuver that. You tell them, "Oh, I want you to just be yourself, but this will be fiction," and then they're very confused by the whole thing. And so, and I find that to be very interesting. And to Taryn's point, I think, yeah, this breathing room, just not always cutting that snippet, or this idea of the word communication is also somewhat of a slippery slope, because you want to get all of that before and after, as the story about the extremophiles, you just want to get all of those digressions, those stories that are happening around the discovery. So I think that when you tell scientists, "No, I just want to film you, sitting at the bench working for an hour," they find it very strange, because you also have to unteach them the way because they've all been on Nova, they've all done these things. And by the way, I think those are really effective ways of communicating science. And it's not necessarily about changing that, but it's just about providing new flavors, so that it's not just one specific way in which we think about it. But I think they're conditioned to think, "Oh, I need to present my data, and this is how I typically do it to the media." I don't think I answered your question though, but yeah.
I would say, to the extent that media informs culture and mindshare, that science does play a critical role in, at the very least, not perpetuating dangerous myths, and potentially providing life-saving information to people across the myriad of sciences that are applicable. And I think it also informs policy. In at least to the extent that people are watching, taking in this information, doing research, and finding themselves more interested in policy that's related. So I don't actually know how to answer the question. I personally feel a responsibility, at least on some level, to not stoke hysteria, to try to leave the audience asking more questions than when they entered the room, and hopefully having a bit more insight and nuance as to a world that, has some scientific basis.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, I agree with both what everyone just said, in the sense that, art is art, and I'm someone who comes from a background where I do think a part of the job of art to be to confound and to provoke. And I like what Alexis was saying, but just I love films where I'm is this real? And there's all this ambiguity that I love seeing in art. And one of the things that I've wrestled with recently, though, is just at the end of the day realizing that a big part of the entire fake news phenomenon is the presentation of absolutely untrue things in the forms that deliver what we think of as being hard facts. I think what's funny is a lot of times we think about this fake news phenomenon as the erosion of truth, and of course it obviously is in some ways, but it's what's really dangerous about it, and why it is powerful, is that all these things are coming in a form that we used to associate, probably incorrectly, but we used to say, "Oh, when that comes that way, it's real." Right? And so I think I agree. And it's both things. I want to have my freedom to just be an artist and to do things that are a little bit crazy and a little bit perplexing and a little bit ambiguous. But man, at the end of the day, if someone walks away from something I made completely wrong about some fundamental fact, that's also a problem. and let alone, knowing that there are people out there intentionally doing that, right? And so yeah, so I same thing, I feel that responsibility, and it's something that I've been wrestling with recently, just because I don't know that I've ever intentionally misled, but there are certainly times in which the kind of art that I enjoy is somewhat on the inaccessible side, is a little perplexing, is a little ambiguous. And I've been thinking recently about but we live in this world where that work goes out into a place where anyone can see it. You know, it's on Amazon. Not just my niche audience can see it. Anyone can stumble onto it, and then they're going to interpret it, and like where my role ends. And I'm really interested in what Alexis said about like, hopefully it's not just me. That there's a team of people, and it's a collaborative effort, and also how you frame it beyond it. But that stuff is on my mind a lot recently, for sure.
Yeah, it feels to me like we're all saying similar things, that a lot depends on the framing and the context and the promise that you're making to your audience. And the filmmaker doesn't have a ton of control over who winds up seeing the finished product. That must be nerve-wracking. But I would agree with what Tom said about how the first duty of care is always to the story, of course. But then it does depend on the framing, right? So there is, for example, a really interesting and important, in my mind, subgenre of science fiction called hard science fiction, which is a little bit like kind of like the locked room mystery genre in detective fiction. Like, there's been a murder inside a locked room. How did it happen? If nobody could get in or out. Well, hard science fiction is sort of similar to that, in that you are explicitly saying up front, I'm going to write a story in which I don't break any of the laws of physics as we know them today. And that, in a way, ups the stakes and makes everything a little harder than if you are going in a more science fiction / fantasy kind of route, and everything's up for grabs. And it can be especially valuable, I think, when you put yourself through those paces, because it means your story is taking place in a world that feels more real, and where it doesn't require any suspension of disbelief, right, to imagine how these things could really happen. And I think when a hard sci-fi story is done really well, it even teaches you something about science. So I would say it all depends on the genre.
To Wade's comment, there's this great film called Fermat's Room. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a Spanish film that came out a few years ago, and it's like these mathematicians that are stuck in a room and they have to solve Fermat's theory. But it's just an amazing film where you understand that all of the characters, all of the mathematicians that are in the room are connected to each other through different degrees of separation. But when you were saying that, Wade, I was just reminded of Fermat's Room, which is an amazing.
It's like locked room meets science fiction.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I've got to say, I mean, I read lots of science fiction in spurts, and then I stopped reading it for a while. But one of the things I really loved reading recently is there's this whole sort of genre where hard science fiction ideas meet fantasy. I think of N.K. Jemison's the fifth season in that trilogy. It starts with it includes many things that don't occur on this earth and are improbable. This sort of subspecies of people in her fictional world that can control the movement of the planet. Movement of tectonic, geology and all this sort of stuff. But the geology is all coherent. It all makes sense. It's plate tectonics, 101. It's great. And that kind and the creation, the sort of fantasy sides of the story create conditions in which you test character. And I think, I found that, I love the science in it, and I love the fact that once she established the rules in that book, the rules were followed meticulously. And I suspect it's a very, very difficult film. If it, I wouldn't be surprised if it's been optioned, but I would be surprised if it gets made anytime soon, because it's a tough nut to crack, I think, filmically. But I don't know if there's any deeper thought than that. But it's
no, that's fine. So my last question of the night is to ask about what's next. So basically, with all that's happened with COVID, and with without getting too political, the kind of general feeling around science and what people are calling the post-truth era, what is next in science fiction and science nonfiction? Science communication? What do you see as the next trend?
Why don't you ask us an easier one and a small one?
That's a great question.
Well, for one thing, I think it's being decolonized, right? It's being opened up to a far wider scope of variety of voices and cultures, and I was lucky enough to do an interview with Natasha Womack recently, who wrote a terrific book about Afrofuturism and has written her own Afrofuturist science fiction. And she was reflecting with me on how the pandemic had affected her community, and I asked her, does Afrofuturism have anything to say about how communities can be resilient? And she said that's basically what our literature is about, right? So I think people are going to be looking for new places for truth and insight, and thankfully, I think the world is opening up to more voices. This is even true true in publishing, in book publishing, magazine and journal publishing. It also seems to be true in Hollywood, where streaming is just opening up an entire new universe to so many more voices. So that's the trend I would point to.
Yeah, Alexis, you said something about representation.
Yeah, I totally agree with Wade. I think not only is it to understand that science is culture, and that that there is a factual way in thinking about science, but there also is a cultural kind of representation of science, and different people deal with different, the pandemic, for example. There are different ways of manifesting, stories through scientific topics, using science fiction and using other, Afrofuturism is a great example. For example, also, in my case, I've been doing a lot. My film takes place in Mexico, so I was really interested in Mexican rituals, and kind of mixing rituals around the Day of the Dead with, CRISPR research on butterflies. Basically, that's what my film is about. So, but I think that, broader representation, also access as well, being able to make these films in different ways, and not having it to be like these kind of huge productions as we think about them, as Planet Earth and these things. And I feel like, low budget science films is definitely something that I would say. And I would also say having more scientists making films and being in front of the camera, I would argue should happen more in fiction. And just to something that Thomas was saying, the connection between science and fantasy, there's also the whole realm of scientists imagining themselves a fantasy, having their own fictions. I was speaking to a scientist at Berkeley that told me how he wanted to get a butterfly tattoo with butterfly ink all over his body. And it reminded me of like the Avengers or the X-Men, but it was basically fiction created by scientists. So I thought that was also interesting.
Let me tell you the story of the moment I felt absolutely whitest. I directed, I conceived of and then executive produced and made one of the films in a series for PBS called Origins. And it was a series that was basically trying to tell the story of the origins of life and the possibility of life beyond Earth from the very beginning, from the Big Bang out. And the big thing I wanted for that series, and I got it, was to have Neil deGrasse Tyson host it. And this was before Neil was as well known as he is now. And that was one of the reasons, that was cute. I'd filmed him as an interviewee in a previous project, and he was just great. And he was a director's dream as a person to have on the far side of the camera. And so I knew he'd be a great host, and I really wanted him, and I wanted him explicitly because I thought that representation was important. And he agreed. And we were filming, it was literally the last day of filming in the last episode of the 4-part series, and we were in his shop in the planetarium at American Museum of Natural History. And he was doing a line. He said, "I'm Neil Tyson. I'm this other thing, and an astrophysicist." And I said, "You don't have to say you're an astrophysicist. You're in the place. You're the director. You've been doing it." And he said, "Oh no, I really have to say explicitly, I am an astrophysicist because of who I am and what it will mean to people who look like me." I went, "Oh yeah, you do." And that was the moment. It's like I should. And he said it, and it was wonderful. It's in the film and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, that was a moment when, something that was obvious to him was clear to me only after he said it out loud. And that was 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And I don't think we've gone far enough since. I wish it were better.
Definitely, we have a long ways to go. does anybody see any other trends with women, in science and discussing stories about science from that perspective, or ways in which, science education is becoming more prevalent, or just the way that science fiction can maybe be an entry point into science?
I suppose as the sole female panelist, I should take this, but I don't know that I have. I don't know that I have an answer that's clever or worth much. Obviously, it was an honor to be able to co-direct with another female director. This film that was very much embedded in the world of neuroscience, and before and since that, I've worked with a lot of companies in other areas of science like biotech and AI, and I think what I'm starting to experience, and I don't think it has anything to do with my gender, but I have sensed that there's much more openness within these companies, institutions, to engaging with storytellers who are good at telling stories, even if those storytellers don't come from a scientific background. There's a little more trust. And perhaps it might be the case that they're realizing that if they don't get on the boat of telling better stories, they will lose funding, they won't, their incentive model is sort of directed at ensuring that the public knows about their ideas. What I would like to see more of is the collaboration between scientists and non-scientists in a formalized fashion, at the institutional level, at these private companies, bringing in people like me who have a passion and a love for science, who can translate these ideas to the broader public, and not requiring a PhD, because in some cases, while that might be really helpful, they're also missing out on an opportunity, I think, in this kind of juicy collaboration that happens between the scientist and the non-scientist to tell a story. So I'm seeing more of it slowly, but I would like to see that a formalized structure within these companies.
Yeah, that matches a bit what Alexis was saying about working with actual scientists in his film. So before we wrap up, Aleem, do you want to add anything else to the discussion?
I actually really all the issues we just talked about in terms of inclusion and diversity, to me, one of the ways they manifest is something that I'm just personally struggling with, and so I'll talk about it for a second, which is to say that when Alexis said we need cheap science films, one of the reasons I love independent film, and I wrote a lot of stuff on the internet about just how I made a cheap science fiction film, and one of the reasons I talk about the budget is to say it can be done. So I really agree with that. It doesn't need to be just the domain of $200 million Marvel movies, right? But the thing that I really that pains me is this push and pull between I love independent film, I love low budget film, I love aggressive, interesting art. But at the end of the day, most people don't watch it. And we live in a world where aside from the Avengers, Star Wars, and maybe the NBA Finals, no one's all watching the same thing, and so I see this in issues of representation. I was just on a panel about representations of Muslim Americans, and it was the same thing. I was listing off all these interesting indie projects, and someone was like, "Look, until there's a Muslim guy in the Avengers, you're reaching almost no one." And so I don't know that I agree with that, but I do think I feel this tension of I love that stuff is bubbling up from the bottom, and I kind of am part of that. But I do think that with just reasserting that facts can be facts and showing who can be scientists, I think if it's not in those big stages, it's hard to, I'm having trouble believing that it's having a big impact, but that being said, I think some of the most interesting work in the world has always been made by people on the fringes and people who are countering the dominant narrative. So I want that work to continue. I think I'm also sort of realizing that when you really talk about these big issues that need to be either corrected or amplified or enhanced in the public mind, there's a few voices that speak to that group. And they're still hard to crack, and they are still rigid in their form and in what kind of nuance they have and who gets to tell those stories, that kind of stuff.
I don't want to bogart the discussion, but just to interject one thing that occurred to me as you were saying this is one of the places where you're getting more of that is in a domain of media we haven't talked about at all, which is just regular broadcast dramatic series TV. I particularly during the pandemic, I've been watching more and more stuff that requires less and less, sort of mental engagement. Grey's Anatomy has been completely this, hospital soap opera has been running, full on COVID, the madness of ignoring the science in COVID, race in COVID, all that sort of stuff. There is a program that NBC is showing that was made in Canada called Transplant, where the lead character is a Syrian refugee, a Muslim doctor. You see him, they actually show scenes of him in the mosque praying on, network broadcast TV. And, everybody around this panel works in more niche, I think it's fair to say, more niche kinds of media. But sometimes, the change happens when mass culture picks up on something. And there's some of that going on now.
Definitely. If history has taught us anything, things that are at the fringes, eventually something hit the chord and they start becoming mainstream. So that's why
I was going to mention that something that happens in the world may like shake something up in the mainstream kind of shell. For
exactly. Sure. Exactly. So on that hopeful note, I'd like to conclude our discussion and thank everyone for taking the time tonight. I know it was kind of on a weeknight, but thank you again. I hope you found this discussion interesting and I hope you met some interesting people.